Hello, everyone. This is probably going to be the last last series of slides in our religion unit. So, picking up where we left off, okay, we looked at these cases, right? Cox and Prince, and we even looked at Lynch versus Donnelly, the Creche case in 1984, about putting religious symbols and things like that in public places. All right, so we have a quirky boundary between what you can and cannot do in regards to the First Amendment pertaining to religion. So with this last set of slides, I'm just going to cover a couple specific cases, and then we're going to look at going to do like our little quiz thing. We're going to just take a look at some, ask what you think. So Marsh versus Chambers is an interesting one. Have you ever wondered why it's legal or constitutional to pay chaplains, to pay for Congress to pay a chaplain, when you would think that might be against the Constitution, at least the Establishment Clause of the Constitution? There's some interesting arguments there, and again, I would encourage you to take a look at the case, at both the opinion and the dissent. But they said basically paid legislative chaplain is allowed. It's consistent with what's valuable for the constituents. That's really interesting, right? I mean, along those lines, you could say a whole bunch of other things that might be surprising, maybe even extra constitutional. But again, I'm just looking at the arguments that the Supreme Court mentioned here. They said that the framers employed them at the time of the writing of the First Amendment, so we should pay attention to that. And then also, this is different from the school cases. Unlike children, adults are not as susceptible to the same sense of indoctrination. So when you have children in a school situation, they're a captive audience. They have to comply. They're required and mandated by law to be there. Here it's different. Adults have the freedom to engage and to disagree and even voice that disagreement, and even petition for those chaplains to be removed or something like that. So that's a different scenario, they say. Mature adults are different from children. So based on a number of those arguments, yes, chaplains can be allowed. Also, this is an interesting one, a very different case that has to do with religion. What if you are an Orthodox rabbi and you're in the military? Is it constitutional to require that person to take off a yarmulke when they are serving in uniform? These are commissioned officers here in the Goldman case. So they said even an Orthodox rabbi who's a commissioned officer can be made to take off yarmulke while in uniform. And again, that's a highly unique situation. It's not very mainstream or common, but it does shed light on that boundary. So the argument here, one of the major arguments by the majority in 86 was that the military are a specialized society separate from civilian society. It's different from Congress. It's different from a school group. It's really unique. And so one of the things that makes it so important for the military to function the way it does is uniformity. We're literally wearing the uniform and acting in a uniform way. Hierarchy, obedience, order, uniform is an essential part of all of those things. And it's actually a life and death life and death issue, especially on the battlefront. Upholding symbolic order by wearing a uniform is of prime importance. So it's different from just, in some other setting, right? So it's an interesting case, deals with the military and with religion. So this is just a highlight here. Couple other things, just to give us a sense of the sort of a more complete boundary there. The court's tradition of refusing to decide on these issues, which is interesting because they tend to, when the court decides to not accept a case, what they're saying is we're going to let the tradition fall the way that states have decided them or appellate courts have. So by refusing to decide these cases, they basically allowed them to continue. So, which is fascinating to think about. So in 1964, they upheld the under God in the official pledge. So they said that's not endorsement of religion. It's a general kind of appeal to the religious heritage heritages of most civilizations. In 1966, they declined to review the religious tax-exempt status for churches. Churches are not, and pastors are not taxed the same way. They can be exempt from tax, and you might think, well, that's giving them special privilege. And so declining to review that has kind of basically maintained that. That's a unique situation. Some of you might know pastors or be related to pastors, and you'll know that it's a little bit more complicated, but not much more complicated than that, about tax-exempt status. But basically, the property of a religious institution is not taxed. So you might think, oh, well, that seems like that is an endorsement of religion. But anyway, there it is. Paid chaplains in Congress, and in God We Trust is still the official motto and currency. One last thing. The main thrust of these arguments tend to be that there's a recognition of non-specific historical religious values. But as you know, if you're looking at the other side of the coin, that is kind of opening up yourself to all sorts of, that argument opens yourself up to all sorts of things. You could say the same thing about slavery in general, or about discrimination, about any number of things. And it's a wonky American thing to kind of want to have it both ways. So here are a couple, rapid fire, a few pop quiz questions. So what I want you to do is we go through, I just want you to pause after I ask this question. Just hit pause, think about it, and then take a look, okay? So we'll do this fairly quickly. So is this protected or not protected by the First Amendment? We're talking about the free exercise or establishment clauses. Is polygamy, that is being married for deeply held documented religious reasons, is that protected? Can you marry more than one person at the same time because this is a deeply held religious value? Pause, think about it, and come back. Okay, so as you know, this is not allowed by law. In fact, it's a crime. So it's not protected. And this goes way back to the early days of the Mormon Church, which held as a deeply held religious view that polygamy is not only possible, but it is preferred in some cases. And of course, they gave up the practice of polygamy legally in exchange for having the federal government allow the state of Utah to be incorporated as sort of a homeland for Mormons. So there's an interesting history behind that, the founding of Utah and polygamy. But that's not gone away. One of the arguments in Reynolds versus U.S. was that the free exercise of religion is not absolute. We all know that. And for some reason, that seems to threaten the concept of the two-person marriage. Kind of some religious traditions, many religious traditions do that. Not all of them. As you know, Muslims have a provision for multiple spouses. On there's certain criteria for that, and they cannot practice that in the United States, but they can technically in other countries. So the Church of Latter-day Saints and Utah statehood we mentioned. But I would say this is me looking in the future, which I'm not very good at, but it seems to me that a number of cases having to do with gender equality, transgender, same-sex marriage, things like that, those have already been pretty much established by now in our lifetime. I think the next wave is going to be what we call polyamory. This is people who love more than one person at the same time and feel deeply committed to them and might even want to be married to them, which might lead to polygamy, but might not. And I think we're going to see another kind of wave of challenges, legal challenges to that, because honestly, and this is just, I'm looking at this objectively, so many of the arguments for this particular kind of religion do seem flimsy when held up to particular logic. They normally fall back on tradition and history, which is kind of suspicious sometimes. So I don't know. I think you might see some cases like that in the future. Here's a quick one. Is this protected or not protected by the First Amendment? Funding of religious school vouchers. This is where instead of going to a public school, you could opt out, take the money that would be going to fund you, in that school, and spend it on a private religious school. Is that protected by the First Amendment or not? Pause and think about it. Okay, we're back. That, in fact, is protected. And the case Zellman versus Simons-Harris in about 20 years ago dealt with that. This is in the Bush administration. They were encouraging this particular option. It's still an option, and they said that any perceived endorsement of religion is reasonably attributable to the individual and aid recipients, not the government. So by allowing this alternate religion does not necessarily, again, in Rehnquist's view, does not necessarily endorse religion. It was a controversial one because you could see an argument where that actually does promote religion. But he seemed to see this as neutral when you look at the nuts and bolts of it. And he's got a point. So take a look at that case for yourself and see what you think. Next to another one. This is fascinating as well. I wanted to end with a few firecrackers here. So this is this protected or not by the First Amendment? If you have a school district that requires the teaching of creationism, that is, that evolution is not the prime scientific mode for understanding human organisms, but it's a more or less biblical view, literal from the Genesis, that God created Adam and Eve, and there's no such thing as evolution. That was not protected by Edwards versus Aguillard, basically based on this premise that protecting academic freedom bestowed no more freedom than before the law. It lacks a clear secular purpose. It's religious in content. Here's a fascinating one. I'll try to make this very simple, even though it's complicated. Is this protected or not protected by the First Amendment? There's a prisoner who is, can this prisoner be allowed to grow a long beard as a religious expression? So there's a lot to this case, but so I took on a complicated one here at the end. But so there was a threat that this person might conceal a weapon or a razor blade in his beard, and he said as a Muslim he wanted to have the right to grow a beard. In this particular case, that is protected. And there are some interesting things to that. Threat of a concealed weapon was not proven. And in that particular case, a prison can regulate some religious expressions if there's a compelling state interest, but not in that case. Okay, two more here. Is this protected or not protected by the First Amendment? What if there's a refusal of a military draft on non-religious or moral or ideological grounds? In other words, do you have to be like a conscientious objector to war as part of your religious belief, say an Amish or a Quaker, or can it be non-religious? So pause and come back. Okay, we're back, and as you can probably expect, there's no more draft that ended about 40 years ago, and the Welsh versus U.S. Said that this is protected. You don't have to belong to a religion or even have a religious position on war or violence to opt out. Now, it's not as simple as that. It's very complicated it was very complicated to get out of the military draft. So here's a good question. Is war taxation, giving your money that will indirectly go towards fighting wars, is that, if you withhold, is that a violation of federal law? It is. Is that upheld by the free exercise clause? And actually, as of now, it is not. It is not protected. Okay, last slide. Haha. Okay. What if you belong to a religious group that uses animal sacrifice? Judaism has, right? And many others. So what if your sacrifice is killing a goat or a chicken? Pause. And we're back. In this particular case, this is a documented religion in Miami. It was found in the Caribbean and West Africa. Lukumi Babalau Aye in the city of Hialeah outside of Miami, and they found that it is protected. Laws forbidding religious animal sacrifice are invalid. How does this differ? As Rehnquist, I think, wrote the head justice, he says, how does this differ from killing for food? Why would we keep religious groups from killing when we kill animals to eat them? It's an interesting thing. So That ends the unit. I hope you found it interesting. There's always a lot more to read on your own. Thanks.